Okay. Um, I believe we're live, and I've just asked somebody to check. I can check on my phone as well to make sure that
It's
we're
live.
actually
I'm
live.
getting the signal saying it's live.
Okay, good.
Do you have to let people in, or it's live? So it's just
I don't think we need to let people in. They will just be able to just see the video and join in. Okay. Yes, we are live.
you have to let people in, or it's live. So it's just
I don't think we need to let people in. They will just be able to just see the video and join in. Okay, yes, definitely live. I've just confirmed that. Okay, so welcome everybody to today um, conversation, is what I would call it. Today, I have the pleasure of having with me my colleague Neemah Ahmed. Welcome, Neemah.
thank you.
How are you today?
I'm good. Happy
Yes,
that the weather's good today as well. Always a blessing when the sun is shining.
yes, it's a lovely, lovely weather. And are you ready for us today?
I'm ready.
Okay. Okay, that's very good. So, just as a bit of an introduction about who Neemah is a former lawyer and a legal researcher, and she has deep expertise in employment and discrimination law. Neemah's PhD explored how identity shapes Black women's experiences of workplace sexual harassment and access to justice. Our work is grounded in Black feminist thoughts, and it highlights how organizational culture and power dynamics influence decisions to speak out about harm at work. So we're very excited to have Neemah today. And for those who that don't know me, just introduce myself. My name is Tutu Popoola, and I am the lead consultant and director at Slick HR Limited. We are a company that provides HR, recruitment, and DEI services based in the UK. So thank you to everybody for joining us. We appreciate, and if you're watching this on replay, um, thank you. Please leave a comment. If you have any comments, please do leave your comments or questions, and we would make sure that we try and answer them. So just to say that today's topic is a discussion. It's not so much we're not, although there are some elements that we're presenting, but we're discussing, and we would like your contribution as well. We would like you to contribute, ask questions, and also try and see if you can answer any of our questions. There are no wrong or right answers. It would be a learning experience for us all. So we're talking about beyond the policy, preventing sexual harassment in practice, and that's what we're going to be discussing today. So we're going to be talking about listening, acting, and building trust. How do employers meet their duty to prevent sexual harassment at work? Do you want to talk a little bit about, Ima, do you want to talk a little bit about the change in legislation that has been introduced where employers now have a duty to prevent sexual harassment at work?
So from last October, as you've just mentioned, all organizations have a mandatory duty to take reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment from taking place. And what reasonable steps means in a particular context, it varies from organization to organization. So
Yes.
if a claim goes to court, the court will look at what the nature of the organization is, and based on what the organization is, it will then see whether adequate steps have been taken to prevent sexual harassment from taking place. So, if it's, for instance, if you're looking at an organization that is sending their employees, outsourcing their employees, and there's an issue of safety, for those employees, and let's say the majority of them are women, then is there any safeguarding that's been put into place to make sure that these women are safe? Are they going somewhere vulnerable where they'll be exposed to sexual harassment or some sort of sexual harm? So it's actually thinking through for your specific company what is important and what can we do to mitigate the risk of this happening to your employees. In this context, it's women, but it can be anybody. The example
Yes,
I gave.
that's what I was just about to say. That I know we do talk about sexual harassment at work or harassment in general, and there is quite a lot of emphasis on, women, how women are impacted. But the reality is that it could be anyone really. It could be anyone. So let's bear that in mind. I mean, throughout our discussion. So another thing that um, kind of came to mind for me is, why has this never been done before? Because historically, if there is any issue of sexual harassment at work or allegations, organizations are required to investigate and to provide an outcome and all of that. But the issue of preventing it is then coming to place in October. It does make you wonder, why has this not been done before? Why is it just happening now? Do you think it might be because of case law, employment tribunal claims? What do you think, in your view,
I think
is
I
causing
think I
these
think that,
problems?
yeah, I think politics informs the law in a way. It depends on which party is in place, and I think to a certain point, there was there was the understanding that whatever there is entrenched in law right now, which we will discuss in a few minutes, would have been sufficient to ensure to ensure that there are measures in place that prevent sexual harassment from taking place. But obviously, it's not been enough, and there's been a lot of lobbying from women's organizations, from charities, to actually make sure that this has been implemented. It's one step forward to make sure, like we have this whole idea that there's this clause in the Equality Act that it should be 3 months less one day before a sexual harassment claim can be made. That's not enough, I mean, I'm talking about women in this situation, but anyone who has experienced sexual harassment is traumatized. So that's another way of
Correct.
stopping claims from going to the tribunal because of the time limit. So this idea of having a preventative measure is only one step towards building a culture where sexual harassment is actually adequately acknowledged and steps are taken to to reduce it in the workplace.
Yes, thank you very much for that. I like what you've just said now, which is actually true, is that politics tend to inform the law. So whatever is in the media, whatever is in the news, and also whatever claims have gone through employment tribunals tend to inform kind of that one step forward or an additional legislation that's required. So yes, that's really important to note. Thanks very much. So today we're going to be looking at a case study. We're going to be discussing a case study, and also I would like us to touch briefly on something that's current, something that's ongoing, which is Cannes 2025, which I believe is ending tomorrow. So, if in case if you're listening, so there are some safe zones that have been set up for the event based on various complaints of harassment that happened at last year's events. So we'll discuss that, and then it'll be interesting to hear Neemah's view on that. And then, yes, we'll also then be looking at our case study. So if we go on to the case study, we've drawn up a fictitious case study, which can actually happen, is the reality based on our practice and based on what we've seen. We know that these things do happen, but so this is a case study. If it bears any similarities to any individuals, this is completely coincidental, as they say. So let's talk about Sarah. Sarah works at a mid-sized marketing agency. After a work event, a colleague Dan begins sending her sexually suggestive WhatsApp messages He later joked with his colleagues about how good she looked after a few drinks. Sarah is humiliated and avoids shared office spaces and stops wearing the dress from that day. Dan's behavior escalates with unwanted touching, wrapping his arm around her, brushing her elbow in the corridor. When Sarah tells her manager, he dismisses it and says, "That's just Dan being Dan." Her confidence declines, past trauma is triggered, and her performance begins to suffer. Dan and the manager are close. Sarah is excluded from meetings and put on a performance plan. She files a formal grievance, but HR takes no meaningful action. No investigation follows. Dan's behavior continues, and Sarah is eventually signed off sick by a GP. So, if there's anybody here that's joining us online, I'm just making sure I'm keeping an eye on the comments as well. If anybody has any comments about this case study, what is the first thing that kind of jumps out to you? Please feel free to post your comments, and we're checking to make sure that we're um, that we're checking your comments. So I know we've gone through this before, but what is the first thing that kind of jumps out at you there,
Okay.
Neemah?
Okay, so before I get into what jumps out at me, I want to highlight some important points in terms of employers' duties, legal duties. The first one is in relation to the duty of care. All employers have a duty of care to their employees, and that means in the situation of Sarah, it means taking her complaint seriously, carrying out an investigation. The second point is in relation to vicarious liability. That means that employers are responsible for the actions of their employees. So the perpetrator, Dan in this case, is responsible for his own actions, but the employer is also responsible for his actions. And the third thing, as we mentioned earlier, is the reasonable steps duty. So if we use that as a backdrop, and when you have a situation like this, it's important for the sake of transparency to enhance the transparency of the company. When you're looking at an issue like this, is to place the aggrieved party, the complainant, Sarah in this case, at the center of what's happening. So if we go step by step to understand what the risks are, which is what HR is concerned with. What are the risks to the company in a situation like this, which happens very often? The first thing is you look at what happens. So Sarah complains to her line manager, and often managers are the first point of contact. And it's really important for managers to know how to deal with this situation, to create a space where the person complaining feels trust and respected. And in this situation, he dismisses her complaint and he says, "Oh, it's just Dan being Dan."
Can I pause? Can I ask you to pause there before you
Sure.
continue? Something that comes because we undertake investigations
Yeah.
about different allegations that has been made. Usually from the perspective of an independent, because companies may be looking for like an independent perspective on an investigation or on an allegation. One of the things that comes up in this is people say managers, CEOs, COOs, when we're asked to investigate, one of the things that they want us to say is it possible that these allegations are not true?
No.
And
Yeah.
is it possible that these allegations are not true? How do we know that it's not? What's the word they use? Her word against is.
I mean,
And that's, I'm explaining that to say that kind of tells you sometimes the mindset behind, how some companies manage these situations. What would you say should be our response when we are in that situation where the company is saying, well, is our word against it, there were no witnesses, for example? What should employers do in that case?
Okay, first of all, the fact that there is no witnesses is not the issue. I mean, Sarah's case, you take it at face value and you reassure the employer that an investigation is going to be carried out, and you
So it's
use
reassurance first, not necessarily
reassurance.
saying whether we believe them or we don't believe them.
No, you say you keep it neutral and you don't take any sides and you say we're going to carry out an investigation. Because the fact that they don't believe it, again, that it exposes to legal risk because they're not taking what's happening seriously. So then there's a fundamental breach. There is a breach there of mutual trust and confidence which arises from the employment contract. They have to there's an unspoken understanding between the employer and the employee that it's based on trust and confidence. So the default shouldn't be, oh, we don't believe this allegation. It should be, we respect what's happened. It's fostering a culture of respect, of not allow, and a zero policy tolerance to sexual harassment. So it's about taking it seriously and you assuring the employer that we're going to carry out the investigation and we'll see from there what comes out. But it's actually taking it at face value. The fact that there's no witnesses is irrespective. Her word is her evidence, and that in itself should count for a lot. So when the investigation is, when the line manager in this case should have been writing down what she's saying in her own words, dating it, making a comprehensive note of her complaint. But in this situation, the issue is there's a conflict. I don't know if that arises in a situation that you have that comes up with HR when you're investigating.
It does all the time that there is an allegation. It's almost like there is, where does the burden of proof lie? There is a question around, could this person potentially be making a false allegation, for example? And we always try to also steer management in the direction of, that's not for us to prove right now. What we need to do is to review whatever evidence is available and investigate it, not to dismiss what anyone's saying, but to look at, what is the allegation that's been made, what's the evidence that we have, how do we investigate? And sometimes, because these issues can be very sensitive, so there is a way and manner to go about it, and it's not just for anybody and everybody to kind of get involved. And also there is a confidentiality aspect as well, where you want to ensure that everything is treated on that strict confidence, in the strictest confidence possible, because they can also be potentially embarrassing for the organization as well.
Yes, correct. And alongside carrying out an investigation, okay, yes, the investigation is important but the company also has to think about the well-being of the employee. So in this case, for Sarah, and I think it's important for HR to point that out, what steps were taken to safeguard her interests and her well-being? Was she asked if she wanted to work remotely? Was she moved from her workstation? Was Dan, usually it's the woman who's moved and the woman who has to bear the consequences. Was Dan asked to move? Was he suspended? In some cases, it's okay to suspend the alleged perpetrator while an investigation is going on. So these two things have to happen concurrently. Respect the complainant. Ask her if she needs counseling. In this case, it's triggered previous trauma. This is not something that the employer would know, but it's something that we come with our own experiences to the workplace, and this is something that she's struggling with. So it's really important, alongside the investigation, to center the complainant's experiences and well-being while the investigation is going on. But here, it's also very interesting, one more thing, that there's a conflict, and because there's a conflict, you have to go back to the ACAS code of practice.
Yes.
One should recuse himself, and it should be referred to HR, but she should be kept updated. I'm sorry, I can't do it. I mean, he just has to say that this will be referred to HR and you'll be hearing from so-and-so, and then HR should then keep her updated. Here, there was no investigation.
One thing that I cannot stress enough is the fact that it needs to be investigated by an independent person, because you need to take into consideration, because we already have a situation where Dan and the manager are said to be very close.
Yeah.
So there needs to be some consideration around who else who else can look into this that's fairly
Yeah.
independent, that's not kind of have like a close relationship or friendship with any of the, either the person complaining or the person that the allegation is against.
So this, in this case, it's her line manager, so it should be escalated to HR. Now, if there's no HR, then it should be outsourced independently. And I have found, and maybe you have found in some organizations, when they're small organizations, like maybe two siblings or a husband and a wife situation where they have few employees, the perpetrator is also the owner. And in that sort of situation, then there's a conflict again, because how do you report it to the, if the perpetrator is actually the owner, what do you do?
If
You
we
know?
look at what we said at the beginning, it's a mid-sized marketing agency. Most marketing agencies that I know, haven't worked with creative agencies for a number of years. They're not massive.
Yeah.
They're not big at all. They will have the core team, and then they would have freelancers that they tend to work with on and off basis. So definitely in this situation, I would recommend having an independent person, perhaps outside of the organization, to look at it. You also mentioned a very important point earlier around suspension with
Yeah.
pay. So suspension under this case, I would recommend, is what we advise, is that it has to be with pay, and also to ensure that you're advising whoever is being suspended that this is not a punitive action and it's not a disciplinary action. It's just that you might need to remove, if they're not able to work from home, they might need to be suspended if them working is going to impact the outcome of the investigation. We don't always recommend suspension. We do a risk assessment to look at the situation and risk assess it and say, in this case, would we recommend a suspension based on, so we have like a process that we go through, and then we decide whether a suspension is necessary or not. Right. Okay. This is an interesting case. I feel like I've taken you off the course now. I'll let you carry on. Let's go back.
Okay, so the second point is so no investigation has been carried out, and so there's a breach there, and there's a breach of procedural fairness, and there's a breach under the contract, because there's a breach of implied trust and mutual confidence. But now, after alongside the fact that there's no investigation, she is being, it seems as though it from the fact that she is being punished for actually for making the complaint. She's
Yeah.
being ostracized. She's been put on a performance plan. She's being excluded from meetings. Now, this is something that happens. I've seen it happening a lot. That the woman, I mean, in this case, the woman, but whoever it is then ostracized. It's almost like she's being punished for bringing the complaint, and that in itself exposes the company to risk of a claim of victimization. The situation in this case becomes so bad that she's called up. She gets a GP to sign her off sick, and this is what happens in real life. The situation becomes so intolerable for the woman that she has no choice but to be called off sick. You know, and if it gets worse, then there's another claim that can be brought against the company for constructive dismissal. And this means
Yes.
that the woman claims that my situation at work is so intolerable, I have no choice but to resign. So you have multiple risks, claims against the company. And it's really important for the company to constantly reevaluate, constantly double audit what they're doing to minimize the risk of these being up, claims being lodged against them and then being upheld, because then there's reputational risk right there.
Thank you very much. That's very insightful information that you've shared there with us. So, and I think we've kind of answered some of the questions that I was going to ask next, which is, what should HR do? And I believe we've already kind of touched on that. And then the next one is, as a line manager, how would you respond in that moment after Sarah's complaint. We kind of touched on it as well. But if there's anybody online who's watching, because I know I can see that we have a live audience, if there's anybody online who wants to ask a question or has a comment on how they think this matter should have been progressed or what should be happening, please do um, post your comments or questions in the chat. We are keeping an eye on it. So now let's move on to. So we've talked about what, as an HR professional, what would your next step be? And now let's talk about as a line manager. I think actually we've covered that.
But it's really important for line managers to get training. I mean, we've talked about what they should do, but in reality, they're not equipped with the skills, the listening skills, or just the awareness to how to to create a space to receive a claim, to receive a complaint of sexual harassment, and they're at the front line. So it's really important for training. This is also feeds into what reasonable steps have been taken. The training. So it's fine to have an HR policy about sexual harassment, but the people, your employees, need to be trained, because it's such a delicate situation that the person is actually feeling that they need to come to you with something. So it's really important for them to get the training, to the listening, that it should be not judgmental. There's a whole way of actually being able to receive that sort of information, and it's really important to get that training.
Interesting. I agree with you, but the reality of what we see is that a lot of line managers have not had the necessary training to be able to navigate these kind of situations. They've not been trained. They don't know how to manage when allegations has been made. I think there was a study by the Chartered Institute of Management that said a lot of managers are what they call accidental managers. They've never received any actual formal management training. Most of them have been promoted because they're really good at their jobs. They have a technical knowledge, and they know, they've been at the company for a long time, so they've been promoted to be people managers, and they've not had training on how to actually manage people. And these are some of the risks that's attached, to in those kind of situations. Is there anybody watching with us, watching online, that has seen a complaint minimized like this, or even unintentionally? So if you can post in the chat if you've seen a complaint minimized like this, or maybe unintentionally, please.
There's one other point here that I wanted to raise.
Yes, please go on.
It's, when you have a situation like this where you have a complaint and it's been dismissed as Dan being Dan. In academic literature, there's a word for this. It's called empathy. It's men in this situation. It's men sympathizing with men to diminish and.
Is it always men though?
But it's the word. It's not always men, but there is a word coined for men who do this. Empathy, which comes from sympathy, but empathy, men siding with men, and this is what we see here. And it happens very often in the workplace, and it's a line manager doing this. So it's really important for managers, mid-level managers, to be aware of the way that they are responding.
To be aware of their own bias as well, because I think a lot of this also has to do with bias. How do you see other people? What's your understanding of certain situations? And I think that it's important that we're aware of our bias when we're looking at certain situations. So sometimes when I'm conducting an investigation, I have to step back and think, is my bias influence? I have to check. We all have it, whether we admit it or not. The reality is that as humans, we all have some sort of bias. So sometimes as a professional is that we question that, and we think, we say, what is my bias in this situation? And is my bias impacting how I'm assessing the situation on the whole? And to be aware of that as well. So him saying, no, that's Dan being Dan, it kind of raises another question for me as well, which is, has this happened before?
It happens all the time.
So has this happened before? Because if they're saying, oh, this is Dan being Dan, then potentially there has been a situation where Dan has been in this kind of where maybe the person hasn't actually made a formal complaint, but they would have observed certain behaviors that is questionable.
Or it's also, it has that, yeah, but it also has that undertone of, oh, don't worry, it's just him, he doesn't mean it, so don't
Yeah.
take it so seriously. Well, actually she has taken it seriously, and actually it has triggered previous trauma.
Yes.
So
Yes. So,
anyway, so
do you think it says something about the culture of the organization as well?
yeah, it fosters a culture where sexual jokes, suggestive comments, um, inappropriate body contact is actually okay. It's permitted, and there should be zero. I mean, part of this whole thing of taking reasonable steps should be that there is a zero tolerance to sexual harassment, and that also includes being aware of your body language and how it affects the other person in a
Do you
workplace.
think that it's quite common in some industries than others? And this is going somewhere, and I'll let you know why I've asked that question in a moment. Do you think that it's more common within certain industries than others?
Yeah, it is.
This sort of behavior?
It is. You see it being prevalent in. From my research, I can say that it happens a lot in the hospitality industry. Like
Yes,
you have
you hit
waitresses
it right on
complaining to
the
their
head.
managers, and I say, oh, "Don't worry, it gets like that. Customers are like that," and it's not taken seriously. And what then should come? Then the question is, there is an issue here, and what risk mitigation can bars and pubs and restaurants take to mitigate that risk? I
I
mean,
also think that certain industries where certainly, within the agency world is also an issue with creative agencies because sometimes there's a lot of entertainment that's happening, and there are certain industries where they have there's a lot of entertainment that happens, whether entertaining clients, there's a lot of alcohol fueled gatherings, should I say. And in my experience, they I'm trying to choose my words carefully. In my experience, so those kind of situations kind of lend themselves to this sort of thing because when people have had a lot to drink, not saying everybody that drinks has this problem, but I'm saying where you're in a position where there is most of your networking, most of your gatherings is of probably evenings, lots of drinks flowing, potentially that's a risk factor, I would say.
yeah.
That's not just, I mean, there are situations where people meet socially and, there's lots to eat and drink and it's never an issue, but it's still a risk factor, something that needs to be taken into consideration, something that we need to think about.
I mean, I don't think we can stop it happening because completely, but we can put the things that companies can do to mitigate the risk and also put systems in place to actually address what's happening. It's the likelihood
So,
of it. I
yes,
mean, how many organizations offer counseling to or support around this issue?
but the counseling is after the situation had happened, though.
But once the investigation is going on, you have to
Yeah,
still take care of the well-being of your employee.
absolutely, I agree.
So those safeguards, like making sure that it doesn't make sense for her to go on paid leave, does it make sense for her to work remotely, these are all part of feed into the reasonable steps. If it's happening after the sexual harassment takes place, but it's building your claim. I mean, it's you have to be as transparent as possible, and you have to show that you've done everything you can even in the aftermath of the claim of the allegation to protect your employee. If a claim is because it's part of building your case. If the woman is if for instance in this case Sarah is actually going to issue a claim against the company, they have to show that that they're dealing with it properly. Because on top of the sexual harassment allegation, she can also say that it wasn't investigated properly. So there are two things right there.
Yes. So we've kind of touched on it, but let's talk about it a little bit more formally. Let's look at the organizational and legal risk. You've talked earlier about we talked about on managed conflict of interest, which undermines trust.
Yes.
There in this case there has been a failure to investigate, and that's a breach of implied trust and confidence, and also
And
there's no
and
procedural
procedural
fairness.
fairness. Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, there's carry on.
So there's also the breach of duty to take reasonable steps. What reasonable steps would you have said that the organization could have taken before this incident happening, or are you referring to reasonable steps after the situation had happened?
So I mean, I don't like to use the word holistically, but it's both. You have to take reasonable steps before is to make sure that is there a proper policy in place. Do people understand it? Does Dan? Well, obviously Dan is not Dan, but the line manager is dealing with the situation in a way that he shouldn't be. So is there training being done? Has training been done? First of all, is there a policy? Is the policy actually bespoke? Is it specific to the organization? Secondly, has there been training done? Thirdly, do people know about it and what it involves? What sexual and what do people know what sexual harassment involves? Because according to
Yes.
the law, it's not just it's purpose or effect. So you don't have to have the intent. So is training being done in organizations to make sure that individuals know it's just not, you don't have to intend to do it. It can be the effect, and the fact that the person feels uncomfortable. There's a subjective and objective strand to it, but part of that is the fact that if she feels uncomfortable, there is a possibility of a claim right there. So it's making sure there's an awareness of what is sexual harassment. How do we stop? How do we create a culture where there's also bystander intervention. Do people are we, how do we make sure that people, your colleagues, intervene, like, or to stop it or call it out from happening? These are all reasonable steps that can be taken prior to.
When it comes to calling it out, it's not always easy though,
It's
because
not always easy,
we need
but
to
it can
consider
be.
we need to consider things like the power dynamics.
Yes,
That's
which is
up.
so embedded
That's
in
that's up.
workplace
Yeah.
culture. Yeah, but it can be done it's not easy, but it can be done in a sensitive way, a discreet way. You can pull the person aside and say, and have a word. There are ways of doing it, but this is all part of risk mitigation and fostering a safe environment for employees to work in.
One thing that I think is very important for employers to note is around the 25% compensation uplift
Yeah.
that the employment tribunal is likely to award if there has been a breach of duty to take reasonable steps. What does this mean? If you haven't followed reasonable steps, either to prevent or after the incident had happened, that's what we've described earlier, to investigate, to decide whether to suspend, to look into the allegations, to decide what the next step is. Those are all what we would call reasonable steps the organization takes. So, if I had an example, the person making the allegation has been awarded £30,000, or let's say £100,000. I'm just plucking these numbers out of the air, by the way. Let's say Sarah's been awarded £100,000 because the company hasn't followed reasonable steps. There is an additional uplift of 25% that the tribunal is allowed to award in this case. So instead of a claim of £100,000, we could potentially be looking at £125,000 on the allegation, which is a huge amount for a
Yeah.
company to be paying out. So let's talk about what other about reasonable steps. I want to emphasize on that as well. I'm putting on the shoes of a senior manager in the company, of a CEO, of a CEO, and they would say, well, there's actually no way of me knowing that my employees are going to be sexually harassed at these events or going to be sexually harassed at work. But let's use an example of an event, for example. They would argue that how am I to know that this is going to happen there, or this is the intention of certain people, or maybe they've had a few drinks and that's happened. How am I to know? I want to call their attention to the fact that they can also have a risk assessment done in advance of certain events, in advance to say, okay, what are the risk factors
True. No, you're right.
and that's something that I think is often forgotten. We've designed a risk assessment that we will be happy to share. If anybody is interested in our risk assessment. There's a free template that we can offer that you can use to assess any situation in advance. So it would cover things like who are the people that are potentially at risk. It would be employees, contractors, freelancers, volunteers, visitors. So bear in mind that this is not just you don't employers don't have a duty to protect only their employees, but also freelancers, any volunteers, or any contractors that work for them as well.
But also feeding into what you said, it's also really important to understand from the ground up, from the bottom up, what the employees think the risks are, which then feeds into the risk assessment. So it's also important to send out an anonymous survey and to understand the sense of what employees feel about the sense of safety within the organization in relation to sexual harassment, and then the reasonable steps that they take then is that's built into the reasonable steps.
Yes. So we identify who are the people at risk, what are the identified risk areas. Example of that could be worker to worker harassment, third party harassment. So under worker to worker harassment,
Hierarchical.
we can look at like whether they have an informal culture that tolerates sexual jokes or banter in quotes. What are the power imbalances? For example, junior staff hesitant to report their seniors. There might be limited understanding of what sexual harassment actually looks like.
But
And
you
then,
also get, sorry, in terms of power dynamics, you also get a situation where you have contra power. So you have for instance, a junior male who's using his gendered power to sexually harass a woman who's in a senior position. So the
yes.
power, there's a role reversal. So that's
So
another form of sexual harassment.
reversal. I think it's,
Yeah.
it's important that you've highlighted that actually. And then there is the second part is the third party harassment, clients and customers or service user behavior, or maybe staff working alone offsite or attending events with alcohol. Agency or freelancer workers unsure how to report concerns. And I think that this one is actually very important. Sometimes somebody that's a contractor in a company might think, oh, I'm not really an employee. I get paid a daily rate. I just want to do my, to my work and go. I'll just pretend that didn't happen. Or they think, I have no rights as a freelancer, so I can't really complain about anything too much because, my work, my means of livelihood may be at risk, and that might be an issue. But just to highlight that the duty still covers freelancers, regardless of what of their employment status. So,
and sometimes they're the most vulnerable. People on 0-hour contracts are the most vulnerable, and we see that in the healthcare industry.
That's true. Should we talk a little bit about that?
And it happens. I mean, in the healthcare industry where. I mean, I'm talking about my research and how women are abused in the workplace, and their situations are so precarious because they go home and they're abused, and they come to work and they're abused, and there's no actually reasonable steps that are actually being put in place to actually protect them. And in many cases, like you said, we talked about the compensation uplift. The women are silenced; they're offered a settlement agreement, but even the way that the whole offer of being compensated for what has happened is all muddled through. So I mean, post the reasonable steps, the way that it's being handled, it's actually being mishandled.
Yes, which is very sad, but this is the situation that we're in. But if you think about those people who are contractors, freelancers, 0-hour workers, how do you think they can protect themselves in this kind of situation?
Well, from what I've seen is they actually are in a very vulnerable situation because in many circumstances they can't afford legal fees. They need help. They need legal advice, and it's trying to find somebody who can actually advise them on how they can actually find a way. They don't want to work anymore because in many situations it's triggered previous trauma, previous abuse that they've been subjected to. So it's trying to find some legal help to help them navigate their way out of the organization with some compensation, because it's impossible for them to work there. And very often they have to file what's called an early conciliation certificate. So they have to go to ACAS because
Yes.
they have they can't afford legal advice. And it's only at that point where they actually say this is very serious and filing an early conciliation, which is actually showing intent to bring a claim, that these organizations then take them seriously and say, okay, we need to do something because it's exposing them to reputational risk. But it's very hard, because even to get to that point, to want to do it, it takes a lot of strength, inner strength, to
It
get
does.
to that
It's
place,
not.
dealing with your trauma as well. So we
It's not
forget as
easy.
organizations that these are people with real lives, and
It's not
real
easy. And also, you think that we also need to consider that because they are 0 hour workers or they're freelancers or contractors or whatever, the company could just no longer work with them. They might just decide, you're too much trouble. We're no longer going to work with you. And if that's their main source of livelihood or their main source of income, they don't want to lose that. So they're more likely to, very vulnerable, as you said, but also they're more likely to accept whatever settlements if they even get to that point.
or put up with it, keep
Or
putting
put up
up
with
with
it,
what's
yeah.
happening. Because
Or
a
put
lot
up
of
with
these
it.
a lot of these workers could be on work permits as well. So there's a revocation of work permit, so then they can't live. It's so complicated. What
It's
we do
very
in the
complicated.
workplace is so complicated. It affects people's lives, employees' lives in so many different ways that we forget, because we're so used to tick boxing and doing what we're actually supposed to be. But you have to look at the humanity behind what is actually happening, and how what we do affects people's lives. You know,
Now that you've just mentioned the visa restrictions as well, it just kind of made me think about clients within healthcare sector. A lot of them have employed staff from overseas. They've sponsored their visa to come and work in the UK, and that then puts them in a very vulnerable position if they were to be in this kind of situation. Because how do they don't want to, potentially may not want to make a complaint because their presence in the UK, their rights to legally live and work in the UK is tied to the sponsorship from the employer. So they're also more likely to put up, with this kind of situation and not really want to make a fuss about it. So they're less likely to want to take out a claim against their employer. So it's just so employers really need to be thinking about, what we said earlier about checking our own bias and not just looking at things from one lens, which is, our own lived experience, but also to consider the lived experience of other people, and how this situation might apply to them outside of what we know and how we live.
because
So that's
ultimately, yeah, because it actually enhances the transparency of what they're doing to address the sexual harassment in the workplace. I mean, there's this really famous quote by James Baldwin, who says, not everything that face can be changed, but nothing can be changed unless it's faced. We can't change the fact that sexual harassment has taken place, for instance, and Sarah, going back to the case study, but we can change, we can do something about how we respond to it.
Yes, thank you very much. So let's talk about the EHRC. They've suggested first. You're the lawyer, so I'll let you talk about that bit. Uh, who, who are they? They've talked about the 8 steps employers should take in this kind of situation. So they've given. Do you want to talk a little bit about, just kind of briefly, kind of list them?
So
What the expectation is
I
for
think
who they are and what expectations
it's basically
for
the
employees.
Quality Human Rights Commission has come up with guidance on what reasonable steps, what would be deemed as reasonable steps. And as I said earlier, it depends from organization to organization what those reasonable steps are. And when a claim is being adjudicated, they look at it by context, case by case. So what I do as my reasonable steps isn't what necessarily another organization would do. So it's really important to look at the guidance, but and to see what weaves its way into what you do and what you can implement. But broadly, it should be about what we mentioned earlier about having proper policies, training, making sure people understand it, having implementing safeguarding mechanisms, and then dealing with it properly, but carrying out. But this is not something that you do once. It's a continuous. It's like an audit. You have to keep doing it every 6 months, and then doing it not as just a tick box exercise. Yeah, we've done an audit, but actually feeding it into the policy, and then actually making sure people understand and implementing that policy. And I mean, some companies have a lot of high turnover. So then, should there be sexual harassment training at the point of induction? Should we actually say this is zero, there is zero tolerance?
Zero
And how do
tolerance.
we actually keep embedding that in our workplace culture?
Thank
It's
you
more
very much.
than that.
Thank you for that. Let's talk about something that's happening now before we close. And that's currently, I believe that CANS is ongoing at the moment. And they've introduced, I believe it's ending tomorrow, and they've introduced safe zones. And I've put a picture up. If you can see the screen, you can see the what that safe zone. Someone is taking a picture. This image is courtesy of Amy Kian from LinkedIn. Someone has sent her a picture of what it currently looks like, the safe zone. Do you think this is a meaningful step? So, just a bit of a background for those who are not aware. Last year, there were lots of reports of sexual harassment and assault during the 2024 event. And in order to mitigate that, in order to stop that from happening again in 2025, they've introduced what they've called safe zones to support attendees who feel uncomfortable or need advice about unwanted behavior. I've put a picture there of what one of these safe zones look like. They're staffed by trained professionals. The zone will be open from 8:30 to 6:30, 8:30 a.m. to 6:30 a.m. the next day across the main venue. And what it's saying is that this is to create a safer environment to reinforce its zero tolerance stance on harassment. Neemah, do you think this is a meaningful step, or is it just very good PR?
Oh my God, this is just it actually the I mean, I want to approach this question from two perspectives. The first perspective is from the complainant's perspective, so the person who's been harassed, and also then from the perpetrator's perspective. And I just think this, first of all, it actually, ironically, it shows that sexual harassment has been normalized at camps, and the fact that they have these and then I mean, they look like small, I mean, what we call in Kenya kiosks, small, which are not even in the close proximity of cans.
They're like gazebos. I think that's what they
Yeah.
call them.
And it's almost, I mean, the sense that I get is like it's normalized. So it's like, oh, it's like a portable pharmacy. Like if you need a Panadol, go and get a Panadol from a pharmacy. If you're sexually harassed, then go here and get and have and somebody will actually, there's someone there to actually listen to you. But the issue is that, first of all, it's being normalized, but it's actually entrenching a culture which fosters sexual harassment, like having this. So it says, okay, it's happening, so then we have this in case it happens to you. But it's actually not addressing the systemic issue, the structures that actually foster sexual harassment that takes place. What we talked about before, the power dynamics. When is it? How do and why is it that there's only? I mean, I see it as a form of performative concern because the underlying structures, the systemic issues are not being addressed. Why can't be, like, if you look at it from the point of view of the perpetrator, why isn't there, if Kansas wants to take this so seriously and have a zero tolerance to sexual harassment, why isn't there an independent organization there ready to investigate claims of sexual harassment? Why isn't there anything to talk about disclosing statistics that this is what's happening? Why isn't there something to say that there should be a public disclosure of what is not public in terms of naming and shaming, but public disclosure in the sense of it's happening, it's so prevalent because it is prevalent. And why? And there should be this organization that carries out investigations. There should be if the complaint has been made, there should be a post-CANS investigation. Companies whose employees who are perpetrators should be suspended. They should be actually not be also allowed to go to CANS next year. Why? That this is, I mean, systemic structures and power structures, it's very difficult to dismantle. But if you don't start addressing these root causes and holding the men accountable, holding the companies accountable for these, not men, but for whoever it is that's causing the
Men,
sexual
women,
harassment,
whoever.
whoever it is, it's
Do
not
you
going to change.
do
There
you
should be
also
more
think
accountability for
do
the
you also
perpetrators.
do you also think that it takes away from the experience of the people who have experienced this behavior? It takes away from their experience of cats because they're there for a reason. They're there to work, to network, to gain knowledge or whatever they're there for. And then this kind of takes away from their main purpose of going there.
No, I don't
What
think
would
it
you
takes
say?
away from it. I just think it just looks like Kansas doing some sort of tick boxing exercise. Yeah, we'll keep putting
I think it
fire.
takes away because now they're going to the time they should spend doing all these other things that they're there for. They're going to spend that time looking for a safe zone. And as I've been as people have commented online, some of these safe zones are a bit far out
Yeah, that's what I'm
from
saying.
where
They're not,
the main events are happening. So now they've got to go and find a safe zone to try and speak to somebody. The responsibility is put on them
yeah.
to try and do something as opposed to um, having some sort of preventative measure in advance of the actual event.
I mean, I don't know how you can prevent it from happening except having these not remedies, but addressing it, like having accountability for the companies, for those individuals, for those people in power who are actually facilitating or are actually responsible for this sexual harassment. That's where the issue is. It's having them accountable, and in terms of like I said earlier, stopping them from having some sort of investigative process.
Yeah.
You know,
So
you
basically,
know how
you don't agree that you think it's just good PR.
I think it's performative care. I don't think it's enough, and I think it's actually highlighting how normalized it is, which is shocking. Post
Yeah.
Me Too, and in light of Me Too, you know. The
That's correct.
irony of it that it scans and this is still a part of the film industry and all of that.
Yeah, thanks very much for your comments on that. I really appreciate. I just wanted to bring it up because it's something that's
No, it's
ongoing
really
at the
important.
moment, and for us to kind of make sure that we've touched on it as well. So we're going to wrap up our session now. I can't believe that we've been talking for almost an hour, and I feel like you know, I could do another hour of this with you, but I want to be respectful of the other people's time because we've said we're not going to take too long. So if there's anybody that's listening or watching back on replay, I've had a fantastic time speaking to my colleague Neemah Ahamed, who is a former lawyer, legal researcher, and workplace consultants. And we've been discussing extensively the topic of sexual harassment in the workplace. What kind of organizations do beyond having a policy to prevent sexual harassment in practice? We've touched on listening, acting, building trust, and also meeting their duty to prevent sexual harassment at work as stipulated by the law. If there's anybody that if you require any support for your organization, please do reach out to us. Uh, our website is www.sleekhr.co.uk. Reach out to us for support. And also for any of the attendees, if you drop us a message, we'll send you a free risk assessment template. We also offer a compliance and culture check-in to spot any key gaps that you have within your organization. If you want any training on sexual harassment and preventing this from happening within your organization, please do reach out to us as well. So we provide practical support to turn written policies into consistent and accountable action. Do you have any final words, Neemah, that you would like to share with us?
No, that it's just that it's been a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you for hosting me. And I just go back to what Baldwin said. Not everything that can be changed can be not everything that's faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed unless it's faced. And
Yes, I like that.
if we use that and we put the employee at the core of what our practices are, it enhances our transparency.
Not everything that can
Not
be changed.
everything, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed unless it's
That is
faced.
faced. Thank you very much. That's I'll hold on to that. And we've had a comment from Farah who says, "Fantastic session, very informative and interesting." Thanks very much for your comment, Farah. Appreciate you. Thank you for your time. Yes. Thanks everyone who has been watching. We really appreciate your time. This is going to be available on replay as well. If anybody wants to watch this back on replay, please do so. And if you have any questions for us, either for myself or for Neemah, please email it to hello what am I saying? Hello, HELLO at sleekhr.co.uk if you have any questions, and after the session, and then we'll do our best to answer them. So once again, I want to thank you very much for your time, Neemah, and I think that you and I are going to have another session because I've really enjoyed this one, and I'm sure our audience have enjoyed it as well. Um, Oh, we've got a few comments. I'm sorry if I've missed your comments before. I need to keep an eye on it. Oh, Bolaji Kalejai, thank you very much for your comment. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can change until it's faced. I like that. So do I. Thank you very much, Bolaji. Much appreciated. We have another comment from Roy Magara saying this has been very well delivered. Thanks very much, Roy. Thanks for your comment. Thank you all for watching. And let's make sure I haven't left anybody behind. I think that's everyone. Okay, thanks everybody, and have a fantastic rest of the day, and thank you for your time. Take care. Bye now.